Great. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be back in BC. It still feels a little bit like home, and I certainly do miss it. And it's always great to connect with the people in the Aquatic Ecosystem Research Lab. Today I'm going to talk about informed or evidence-based conservation and management. And I'm just going to tell you a little story in terms of how I sort of got into this, and it's thanks to teaching. I think teaching and research go hand in hand. When I first got to Carleton in 2005, I ended up in a first-year seminar course, and I had the students do their first essay. So first-year students, they had to do an essay or research paper with references. They could choose the topic. And I had two students hand in papers, both on the effects of climate change on polar bears. One of them put a very compelling case together about how climate change was the worst thing ever for polar bears, going to see their demise because of climate change. And the other one concluded the exact opposite, how climate change may in fact boost populations. It was going to be great for them. And so I was sitting there scratching my head thinking about this. You know, how possibly could this be that two different people could go to the literature, mine it, and come to completely different conclusions? And there are a variety of reasons why that can occur. And the reality is that occurs in the real world as well. It doesn't occur just in the classroom with newbie students. And so I'll sort of walk you through some examples of these issues in my talk today. So I'll remind you of this dark time in Canada. Not sure if any of you were in Ottawa at the time and participated in any of these activities. I think there were regional activities, and knowing my Vancouverite friends, I assume there were some actions out in this part of the world as well. But certainly there's this idea of the death of evidence, and then we saw groups like Evidence for Democracy come to the fore. And then we had an election, and the word evidence was all over the place. Okay, so and I really like this article in the Straight that talked about how evidence-based policies really paved the way for the Trudeau win. And then, for the first time, we were showing the mandate letters. And so this happens to be just the cut and paste of the top of the letter for the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. And here's a snippet of text in there. So your task is to ensure that decisions are based on science, facts, and evidence and serve the public interest. So we were starting to see that word evidence, being used all over the place. Shortly after the election, I ended up doing presentations at the headquarters for Parks Canada, ECCC, and DFO, telling them about my perspective as to what evidence was. And so the idea to bring in an outsider and to help sort of define and understand what a word meant and what it meant to do evidence-based conservation and management really got me thinking about how we need to do a lot to build capacity in this space. And that's not to say that we don't have science-based government agencies in Canada. We have scientists embedded in all sorts of natural resource management agencies here at the provincial and territorial and federal levels. But science isn't necessarily evidence. So in Canada, we have lots of folks that work on our behalf to manage our natural resources for us and for the public good. This happens at a variety of levels, and we also have various co-management agreements in place. We're increasingly seeing Indigenous communities take an active role in managing their natural resources. There's expectation of consultation and engagement in almost everything that we do. And there are various science-based processes that exist within all of these organizations that I showed to on the right of the screen, except they're all different. How Parks Canada brings evidence to bear and science to bear in decision-making process is very different than what DFO does. And we'll talk about DFO in a little bit, in more depth a little bit later. Some of the routine issues that our practitioners deal with on a day-to-day basis are things like plan review for new developments, restoration of degraded watersheds, fish and wildlife management, and so on. They also deal with a variety of bigger files, things like major dam developments and pipelines. But at the end of the day, we have people that are making decisions, some big, some small, every day. Okay, the question is, are we basing those decisions and actions on the best available evidence? You know, are we bringing everything to bear on those decisions to make sure that they're the best possible decision? Because at the end of the day, decisions cost money. They can also be costly if you make a wrong decision and a species goes extinct. They can have various socioeconomic consequences and so on. Okay? We can waste resources, we can waste time, and we can simply make the wrong decision and actually do more harm than good. So there's a paper that I read quite a while ago, and it was sort of just at that time where I was transitioning into the professoriate, and right before I got handed those 2 polar bear essays. And the title of the paper is, Do Conservation Managers Use Scientific Evidence to Support Their Decision Making? And the answer is not really. What they tend to do, and this is based on a survey of land managers in the UK, okay? And what they found was that their activities were largely based on experience. We've way, so we'll keep doing it. It's just tradition. We feel comfortable with this, so let's just stay with the status quo. And so we have managers not making full or systematic use of the information available, that full suite of information that's available to support decision making. Now you might be sitting there saying, well, you just said this is for land managers in the UK, this is Canada, things are different. Well, guess what? It's not. So Nathan Young, Vivian Nguyen, and a few other folks have done some social science surveys talking to various knowledge holders in BC, including fisheries managers within the Pacific Salmon Commission and DFO, and it turns out that the primary method of science and information sharing in BC is what I call cross-cubicle communication. So where literally you go to your immediate neighbor, okay? And what's fascinating here is we're talking about organizations. DFO is quite an impressive science pillar within their organization. But those individuals, the practitioners, the managers, are not even using their own science staff within their organization. Sometimes they're not even in the same buildings, which is how things are organized out here in BC. So folks are not using all of the possible information that's out there. In the background, we have people like Hilborn musing about this idea of faith-based fisheries, a strong movement of faith-based acceptance of ideas, and a search for data to support these ideas rather than the critical and skeptical analysis of the evidence. And he presents interesting examples in that paper. And then Hilborn Branch and one of their team members put together this really interesting piece. They looked at papers that had been functionally debunked, where somebody had written a rebuttal and determined that the thesis of the original article or the conclusions at the end of the article didn't necessarily jive with their data, and so sort of debunking it, yet we go on and continue to cite those papers 17 times more than, and 95% of the cases where those papers are subsequently cited accept the initial thesis, okay? So it emphasizes how a single paper, even if we as a community determine after the fact that, well, not as great as we thought it was, can really have a big impact. And then we retract papers. So here's you might be familiar with Perchgate. So this was a pretty high profile example where there's evidence of academic misconduct, a paper that initially appeared in the journal Science that suggested that European perch populations were going to be decimated by plastics. And it's complicated, there's a lot of nuance to the story, but the point is it was retracted. Well, guess what? We continue to cite it. It was cited 11 times in 2018, according to Frederick Jutt, one of the folks that identified and sort of called out this case of academic misconduct. And I haven't looked in 2019, but I'm going to guess that we are continuing to cite it and not citing it in terms of, hey, here's an example of a paper where there was misconduct. We're continuing to cite it to say, hey, guess what? Microplastics are causing population declines in European perch. So, bias, okay? There is a lot of literature out there for us to pick and choose from, and so I'll go back to my sort of introductory comments when I talked about the polar bears. It's exactly what the students did. Some decided that they would pick and choose literature that built one side of the story, and the others sort of focused on the other. And it can go back to something as simple as the search terms. The search terms you might use to sort of, build a case around climate change having an effect on polar bears, having a negative effect, might in fact even use different search terms. So there's all sorts of bias that can creep in various places. So we've got all sorts of literature out there, all sorts of things that we can pull upon, and it basically provides opportunity for bias to creep into anything we do when we're trying to amass and synthesize literature. So it's not easy for a practitioner, okay? You imagine you're working at DFO, putting in your 40-hour work week, the phone's ringing constantly, you've got tons of files to deal with, you're under-resourced, and oh my gosh, you've got to try and keep up with the literature. I suspect all of, other than those of you that might be studying for qualifying exams, finding time to read and keep up with the literature is really, really quite challenging. So somewhere around 2 million papers published per year. There's over 28,000 journals, and we passed the 50 millionth paper mark in 2009. So how can we expect practitioners to keep up with the latest and greatest science that's coming out? There's of course an accessibility argument as well. Even though there's science out there, maybe our practitioners can't even get their hands on it. This is a figure that's showing publication year through time versus the percent of articles that are various types or forms of open access. And so here you can see we're now at about 30% of papers are open access, but really it's the gold here which is the best. That means that anybody can download it at any time. Some of these have various caveats associated with them. For example, it's only 2 years after the paper is published that it actually becomes accessible. So we've got about 12% of the literature globally that is open. I know there's other ways that we can get our hands on things, but hopefully this is getting better, but we still have a long ways to go. And in Canada, even if you want to get your hands on literature, if you're a DFO practitioner, you might realize that some of the good things have already been burned. So this is going back to Harper era, and you can pick out, this is a dumpster. This is a picture taken by a DFO research scientist in Winnipeg, and that's Environmental Biology of Fishes journal there, and River Regulations and River Research and Applications journal there, and so on. And so we're literally throwing out the stuff that our practitioners need to guide them. So taking you back to this paper led to a bit of an awakening, and Bill Sutherland, Andrew Pullen, and other folks wrote a paper calling for the need for evidence-based conservation. This was not an entirely new idea, this idea of using evidence to guide decision-making. And in fact, Terry Knight, who happens to be Andrew's partner, had been doing it for quite a number of years in the medical world. And in fact, this is something that we on all the time. So there's something called the Cochrane Collaboration, where they do Cochrane reviews, and Cochrane exists so that healthcare decisions get better. Okay? When you go to a physician, they're all playing from the same playbook. Okay? You walk in and say, I've got a common cold, and they're going to hand you a tissue box and have you walk out the door. They're not going to give you antivirals. Okay? So there's a common playbook, and that playbook is updated. Every once in a while, you will hear something on CBC where, hey, guess what? They've changed how often somebody has to go in for mammograms, or they've changed the approach to how we're dealing with a certain disease condition. That is because the literature is constant. The literature base is constantly being updated, reevaluated, and so this is just how it works in the healthcare realm. So they do something called systematic reviews, okay? And I'm going to tell you a bit more about systematic reviews in a few minutes, but it's regarded as the highest standard in evidence-based healthcare. So the gold standard of evidence synthesis. It allows one to investigate the effects of different interventions for the prevention, treatment, and rehabilitation of various ailments. And so one asks simple, clearly formulated questions. So can antibiotics help in alleviating the symptoms of a sore throat? And then you amass all that literature, it gets evaluated. And a big thing here, though, is that not all literature is equal. Okay? And so in the medical world, if it's not a randomized double-blind trial, it might as well exist. Okay? So it's also about the quality. And these reviews, as I already mentioned, are updated regularly. And so I suspect most of you have done a literature review in your thesis. The first chapter is usually a literature review. And you basically hit the library and just use whatever search terms you feel like, and find what you find and write up a literature review based on that. You may or may not do a meta-analysis with the information where you do something quantitative. A systematic review is different, and then there's a very clearly defined question. It's not just about what you can find in the primary literature. You need to find what's in the gray literature, transparent, objective, repeatable, and so on. But the big one here is this critical appraisal of the quality of the evidence. And so what do I mean by that? It's really about how much we trust the findings and why. So how often have you read a paper, you look at the results and the findings and say, whoa, okay, here's what I take away from this. And then you get to the end of the paper and the authors actually say something that doesn't necessarily jive entirely with their findings, okay? So what it means is going back and revisiting. Maybe there was insufficient statistical power. Maybe they had a crappy experimental design. All of these things which can makes it difficult to take their value, and then asking how well can we generalize from this study in question. And so the reason why we need to critically appraise is because, frankly, you can get anything published. I thought Pedro Perez-Neto said it well in his fairly recent Oikos opinion paper, and he said peer review is increasingly about deciding not if a paper gets published, but where it gets published. And then we've got this really interesting example from Brian Neff and Julian Olden. Is peer review a game of chance? Again, the answer is yes. So if you roll the dice enough times, you can get your paper in. So if 6 journals are sequentially targeted, there's an 80% chance that a manuscript of low suitability, and they deem a manuscript of low suitability to be one that only half of the scientific community would recommend accepting ever, there's a likelihood of it being accepted if 3 referees are used, okay? And that's just some simple math and rolling the dice. So, and we know this is going back to the 1970s. More than 90% of the papers rejected by one journal are eventually published, oftentimes unaltered in another venue. And I'm going to guess that number is probably higher now because we have more options. So, Andrew Pullen and collaborators created something called the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. And so this is sort of their response, or the environmental equivalent to the Cochrane Collaboration. It doesn't cost anything to belong. It's not a secret club. The idea is to help our community learn and understand what we mean by evidence-based conservation, how to do systematic reviews, and providing fora for sharing them. There are 6 such centers around the world. We established ours at Carleton in 2014. It took a while to get off the ground, but we now have about 9 people full-time doing systematic reviews, mostly for DFO, but also for parks and ECCC. The guidelines, this is sort of Bible. This is what we use to guide us in our systematic reviews. This is not a 10-page document. This thing is 300 or 400 pages long, okay? And we follow a very strict set of guidelines. It's extremely repeatable. So the idea is, at the end of the day, if we've got the same question as a starting point, at the end of the day, if Brett does it and I do it and you do it, at the end of the day, Peter, hi. At the end of the day, we're all going to get the same answer, okay? That's the premise here, okay? And again, going back to my polar bear example, that clearly didn't happen for my first-year students. They got very different examples asking more or less the same question, and that was because of bias creeping in a variety of ways. So I'm going to give an example of how one of these things is played out for us, but I also need to bring in sort of the reality. And again, remind you that practitioners need to make decisions every day and are making decisions every day. And so the example I'm going to use relates to what we call offsetting strategies or compensation strategies for fish spawning habitat. And this was done for DFO. So a good example up on the screen here, this is not a natural stream. The natural stream is back here, and so they've carved out an additional area, increasing the amount of available spawning habitat. It's very stable water flows. They can manage the number of fish that get in to address density-dependent issues and so on. Okay, so they have created new habitat, and the question is, does this work? Or when our taxpayer dollars are used to create rock piles or add wood to a stream, all of these interventions that we do, and it's all being done with the best of intentions, right? These are our tax dollars being spent with the best of intentions, okay? So the question is, does it actually work? So these are the series of steps that one goes through to do a systematic review. It takes, best case scenario would be sort of 1.5 years from beginning to end to do one of these things. You start out with defining our primary question was, what is the effectiveness of spawning habitat creation or enhancement for substrate spawning fish? And you can have sub-questions that come off of that as well. So for example, how does that vary among families of fish relative to different intervention types and so on? We then develop something called Pico, okay? So the P stands for population. So we're looking at substrate spawning fish in north and south temperate regions and so on. Then our intervention. Well, the intervention in this case is spawning habitat creation or enhancement measures. Our comparator or study design. So these are the approaches that we will accept reasonable. So a study has to be done in one of these ways for us to bring it into our systematic review. And then the outcomes. So we're looking at abundance, density of nests, eggs, and so on. Okay, so we develop our, and then we publish a paper. Okay, and so this is a paper that gets cited once by yourselves when you publish the actual systematic review. Okay, this is the systematic review protocol, and it gets peer reviewed, and it gets shared publicly. And so first of all, it's saying, hey guys, we're doing this, so it probably doesn't make sense for you to do one and you to do one. It also allows people to know that, hey, I'm working in that space, and I've got this thesis I've been sitting on that would be great. I'm going to share it so that it can get incorporated. But it's also really consistent with this idea of improving reproducibility. So you probably have something called the reproducibility crisis. This is extremely concerning in the healthcare realm. In the ecological realm, well, we know there's a lot of natural variation out there, and perhaps we're a bit used to it, but I think this is coming our way as well. So the British Medical Journal now requires that if you are going to if you plan on publishing a study there on a drug trial you have done later on, an empirical study, that you need to first of all actually do something similar to this, not for a review, but you need to publish your study plan ahead of time, get it peer reviewed, then you actually do the science. So this is something that is being heralded as one way to address the so-called reproducibility crisis, and that's one of the reasons we do it in the context of systematic review. We then go out and do a variety of searches. This is an example of one of our bowling strings here. And this is a gross underestimate of the effort involved. So we have all sorts of really hardworking, usually recent graduates from undergrad that we hire as co-op students during their degree or afterwards, and have them essentially troll through the literature. And so we say websites. Well, what does that mean? Well, we create script that actually scrapes through identified websites looking for key terms, and then we screen the top 500 hits from each of those to see if they're relevant. So it's not just about, your quick, I'll throw a few search terms into Google Scholar and what we get is what we get. This is quite thorough, and this can take quite a bit of time. We then screen the articles based on the Pico. So again, asking about the population, asking about whether or not the type of intervention, the comparator, and the outcome. And so this is sort of what, so you start, in this case, we started with 5,000 plus things that we found through our searches. We removed duplicates. We screen at title and abstract, and then we get all those articles, screen them at full text. And then you can see here that we also keep track of why things get turfed. So if we didn't use that study, why? What was our rationale for excluding one or including it? And so you can see here in some cases it wasn't quite the right population. It was focused on juveniles, didn't have appropriate comparator or so on. We can find things from other sources. So we go back through through other reviews, looking in their reference list and so on. We have articles that come to us from just emails, various Greylit and so on. And at the end of the day, we ended up with 70 articles that contained 75 data sets. We then extract the data, and this is just a small screenshot of just a fraction of the data that we extract from each paper. We then do the critical appraisal. So we work carefully with a team of stakeholders. So in this case, we had folks from DFO's Fisheries Protection Program. We had people that work in DFO Science Pillar. We brought on a few academics that work in the habitat science, habitat restoration sphere, and we worked collaboratively to come up with the critical appraisal tool that we then used for all of those papers. So even though we've now got it screened down to a series of papers, it still doesn't mean that we don't know anything about their quality yet. So when one does this, this is what the literature looked like. So essentially, we got a bunch of low and medium validity studies. We got very few that were considered high validity. See here, none in fact. And you can see here, the upshot is that the proportion of medium validity studies is increasing through time. So we're getting a little bit better at doing higher quality science, but we're still shooting somewhere around the 40 mark. So far from perfect. We then do the actual systematic review, which may or may not involve meta-analysis. I'm going to take this down to one slide for you. So basically, we were able to do meta-analysis on a few very specific questions. One of them was whether or not the addition of rock as a substrate was beneficial to spawning fish. 5 of the 6 papers were based on salmonids, so we can assume that that should probably be thought of as being salmonid specific. And it turns out that there was some benefit. There was definitely a positive net benefit from the addition of rock for salmonids. Okay, so probably not super surprising. But there were a lot of things we could, does this work for smallmouth bass? We have no idea. Does this work for walleye or sturgeon? We have no idea. One of the problems is lack of long-term monitoring data. And one of the things that if you've ever gotten money to do restoration work, you might have been looking at it thinking, wow, I want to do some science here too. And rarely is there money for monitoring and science built into restoration funding. So the dump truck backs up, the politician's there for the photo op, the rock pile is built, everybody leaves, and we just assume it works. Oftentimes there's a lack of comparator as well. We just build rock piles. We don't actually go and compare an area where we didn't build rock piles to ask whether or not it worked, or do it in a before-after context. And as I noted, it's biased towards salmonids. So we went back to DFO with this, and they were very disappointed that we had essentially screened out the bulk of the literature. The bulk of the literature is so crappy that we couldn't use it in the formal systematic review. But our practitioners are making decisions, okay? There are people that need to make decisions about walleye spawning habitat, about sturgeon spawning habitat every day, okay? So is this where we stop? Do we just end there? The purists, Andrew Pullen would say, we're done. But we also have to be pragmatists that these, people are making these decisions. So we decided that what we wanted to do was to use DFO's internal science review process called Csis to bring our systematic review in and all the other literature in as well. So Csis is DFO's internal science advice process. It's how they deal with some sticky stock assessment issues. It's how they take science that's produced and sort of turn it into a 1 or 2 page document that then gets put on the desks of various practitioners. It involves, some of you I'm sure have been involved in these, usually anywhere from 20 to 100 external experts which sit around and sort of rip apart these research documents which are written to generate that sort of consensus report at the end. In 2017 at the Canadian Science Policy Conference in Ottawa, a few of us assembled to talk about the future of Csis. It's something that's currently being revisited and thought of how it could be improved. And one of our conclusions coming out of there, maybe because I was on the panel, was that systematic reviews could be incorporated into this process. So this was an opportunity to sort of test drive that. How does this work? So we had our systematic review that we did here. Okay. And then we also did a review of all the low-quality studies. So Laura Elmer, where are you, Laura? You're here? Oh, she didn't show up. Laura's a PhD student in my lab, and she happens to be in Vancouver right now. So because she couldn't TA, it was a perfect opportunity for me to buy her out of her TA, because she's in Vancouver, and have her troll through all these other literature. And so she assembled a 140 some odd page literature review that used all of that lower quality evidence. And then we came together in Ottawa a few weeks ago, and we sat there for 3 days as both of these documents were ripped apart by our colleagues, and I'll sort of share a few things with you. So first of all, we were able to bring in 78 more of these studies that we'd been excluded. So we were able to bring 78 more of those in. We were able to bring in additional ones from other sources. We increased, instead of from 70, we're up to 100 with data sets. But I'll remind you, these are of potentially dubious quality. If you look at the types of experimental designs, the +4, for example, means we added 4 more. So it was 13 and now it's at 17 or whatever. And you can see where we added them was largely in the post-treatment ones, where basically somebody just builds rock piles and then shows up the next day to see whether there's fish spawning on the rock pile. So that's not exactly over knowing how it's changed through time, and it's suboptimal experimental design. So one of the biggies was we were able to bring in that type of literature. We were also able to bring in a number of more species, but as you can see, the salmonids still dominate, and we were able to get a better capture a variety of different intervention types, everything from full-on water body creation, combinations of things, modifications, rock material, and so on. And again, for brevity here, I can only focus on, I'll go back to that simple rock example. And so here's what we found with the systematic review. So on average, a 90% increase across those 6 studies in terms of abundance of fish on those habitats. And then if you look over here, when we did use the lower quality data, we get a number of 18%. We couldn't do formal meta-analysis on this because of lack of comparators, but 18%. The lower validity studies were 13%. The medium ones, and high here does not mean high as before. This is a new high, which is like barely acceptable, is 31%. So a couple of things here. So first of all, the better quality data, which was limited almost exclusively to salmonids, suggested a much stronger effect. The poor quality studies seem to generate benefits that or document benefits were less so. So there are a number of other systematic reviews that we currently have underway for DFO. Here are 3 of them. So questions related to effectiveness of fish passage devices, various captive breeding program activities, and fish entrainment. But one of the messages that I want you to walk away with, those of you that go out in the field and actually play with fish and do experiments, and you need to do good science. If you're pretending that you are doing mission-oriented work, that you want your work to have impact, to be relevant, you have to do high-quality science, or it will not meet the muster. It will end up in the pile of low-quality crap that can't be used in systematic review. So this is certainly what we are doing as a lab now. We're revisiting how we do our empirical applied work and making sure that it fits the bar to be at least of medium and ideally of high quality. Now you might be sitting there saying, well, Cooke, why not make it all high quality? There are some instances where it simply cannot be done. So for example, I'll use a systematic review we did for Parks Canada on the effectiveness of fish removal studies. So essentially, somebody finds an invasive species, and they send out a crew immediately to rotenone it or electrofish it, and then you come back next week and measure it, and well, they're gone. You don't have any pre-data. You just know that there was all of a sudden something in there you didn't want to be there, and you had a rapid, you deployed a rapid killing team to get rid of it. So it's very difficult to embed something like that in an experimental design, but there's still some valuable lessons that could be learned and shared from that. So that's an example of why sometimes one might do science that right from the get-go is never going to be deemed to be high quality. I also want to note, I don't know if Tara Martin's in the crowd, but there are other ways of doing conservation decision making. And it's not that one is better than the other. And so we felt like when we were reading the literature that it was very much sort of being set up that way, where Possingham's group and sort of the conservation prioritization stuff was sort of being argued for over here. And then you had Sutherland and Pullen advocating for systematic reviews. And then you had other folks that do structured decision making, people like Mike Jones. And at the end of the day, they're all valid tools and they all have their place and they're all complementary. And so I just wanted to, for those of you working in different spaces, I don't want you to walk out of here thinking that systematic reviews are the best and only approach to conservation decision making. I also want to touch on something that I call the Canadian context, and there are a variety of things that are relevant to Canada, but this one is particularly important. And there are different ways of knowing. I use Indigenous people as the example, but we could also talk about the fishers that we interact with as well. How do we take the information that they have in a respectful manner and bring it to bear in formal processes such as these? I don't know the answer. There's a team of us working in Sweden right now with the Sami people trying to understand the effects of mining on the ecosystem, including the Sami people and their culture. And so we're using that as an example of, or sort of a test case to see how that can work. So at the end of the day, my hope, and the reason I'm involved, is that's highly relevant to Canada, and hoping some of the lessons from there we'll be able to bring back and apply in our Canadian context. So the reason I really like systematic reviews is they're hard to ignore. They're the standard operating procedure for how healthcare agencies work. This is how Health Canada operates. So the idea that Parks and DFO and Environment Canada could do the same is not. The other thing is, don't pretend that judges don't know what a systematic review is. They do. They're the kind of rigor that can stand up in a court of law. You can march in 3 or 4 experts, but if you've got a systematic review there, that's really hard to argue with. It ensures that the limited resources that we do direct towards conservation and environmental management activities are truly beneficial versus perceived to be beneficial, which is sort of the standard here. It's a transparent, repeatable, scientifically justified, and it really makes it difficult for the public to be critical when government follows what a systematic review says. It may be unpopular, but at the end of the day, it's really hard to say, well, all the available evidence said this and we did the opposite. So it makes it easy for government to sometimes do something that is quite tough. And similarly, it forces accountability. If they've done the opposite and you've got something that says this is how we should do things, that gives you a fair amount of ammunition. I do want to throw in the caveat, there's a human dimension to all aspects of decision making as well. So, and thankfully, I'm not a natural resource manager. In terms of CSAS and systematic reviews, this was a first test drive. I think a lot of the practitioners were certainly frustrated with the idea that they felt like there's a lot more out there in file drawers. We kept being told at CSAS, we know this. It's, we've got these reports. They're in our file drawer. We're like, well, what, and they're like, well, there's memos and this and that. So one of the things we need to do is do a better job of empowering our practitioners and regional biologists when they are doing science to collect it and archive it and share it in ways so that you can then have a scientist troll through it every few years and synthesize it and learn from those. They were certainly, as I said, equally interested in everything that we excluded. Anything that will help point them in the right direction, I'll use that sturgeon spawning example, is helpful. Most CSAS research documents are generated in-house at DFO, and so certainly there's need to be developing capacity within. We've done a couple workshops for them, and we're including scientists and managers on our review teams to help them get up to speed in that way. But one of the other things beyond the actual systematic review, handing somebody a document or a brief the key points that come to it. There's two other things that come out of a systematic review that practitioners love. One is a searchable database that contains all the PDFs. So they don't have to go to the library. They don't have to interlibrary something from across the world. Our annual bill with the library at Carleton for the last few years has been well over $30,000. Thankfully, our research office considers that an in-kind contribution, so it's nice to see my overhead actually being used for something meaningful. But $50,000 of library expenses is what we estimate was devoted to this, to the examples I showed here. So that's the professional staff in the library bringing in all the hard-to-find things that we were unable to get our hands on online. And so they have access to all of that. And then second, it gives guidance to the science pillar of DFO. So DFO scientists, now, if they're going to go do science to support their clients, the managers, usually the managers that are paying for that science, they can ensure that it's done at as high a quality as possible so that it actually fits into or feeds into and builds that evidence base to inform DFO science staff. It also can help them identify the types of monitoring needed in regulatory capacities. So yes, you know, you can put in a stream crossing, but if you're going to do so, here's the monitoring that we require, and it needs to be done to this standard. Okay? Allocation of dollars and so on. I love this quote from Andrew Pullen. The paradigm shift in decision-making achieved through evidence-based approach in medicine and other fields is a template for significant improvement in conservation practice. I certainly agree with that. And so I'll end with this. Are we basing aquatic conservation and management decisions and actions on the best available evidence? I would say largely no. I think bias abounds in how our practitioners, again, all well-meaning, okay, are doing their business. And so there's a lot to unpack there. We need to think about how we as scientists share the information we generate. We need to make sure that the science we do is relevant, that it's of an appropriate quality, that they can use it, that it actually informs and builds a high-quality evidence base to guide us. If you'd like to read about how we think this concept can be applied in an aquatic context, you can check out this paper that I've got up on the screen. So thanks for your attention.